and breakup, and has been called one of the great reporters of our age by the BBC special correspondent, Fergal Keane. Welcome, Anjan, to GALF.
Thank you.
And we have another member of Goa Writers in conversation with him, a person equally, if not more, accomplished. Seema Mustafa is an Indian print and television journalist. She is currently the editor-in-chief of The Citizen, a digital newspaper that she has founded, and a fearless newspaper, I must add. She is the elected president of the Editors Guild of India. Was. Okay. Over to both of you.
Thank you, Gautami. And welcome everyone, and welcome Anjan. We are meeting for the first time, and I think the greatest thing was that I was able to read part of what you've written, and it's really good stuff. What I think Gautami hasn't said is that he was a mathematician, and he is a graduate, do you call it a graduate of IIT Madras?
I didn't graduate, so I just did 1 year.
Okay. Electrical engineering, went on to Yale, continued to do maths, and then did a PhD in journalism. Who does that?
That's true.
I mean, we are so unqualified compared to you in journalism. We just learnt it on the roads, but good. And then he's written 3 books, which we are going to discuss, definitely one of them, because it's very significant even in today's times. But I'm going to start with the fact that you also made 4-part series. One was Coded World, right? 2019, which was on artificial intelligence and things. But the second part is what I thought was very interesting, the 4 parts in 2016, where you on deciphering India.
Right.
So, and the other thing I didn't add was that he was offered a job in Goldman Sachs, and he rejected that and dropped that, and went to become a stringer with New York Times and with AP, Associated Press, which is the American news agency. Let's start with, I'm going to question you on some of your background, because I think it's really interesting and exciting. One of the features in that 4-part was, one of the parts was on the great Indian male identity. Now the students have gone, but they were very interested in earlier sessions, asking everybody about gender and about women writers, why do they write about male protagonists, etc. Now in this great Indian male identity, what have you explored? The patriarchy of the Indian male, or have you glorified it?
No, we actually hung out with a lot of patriarchal figures, whether in government or the average sort of in joint families. And being a male presenter, I tried to explore the family and professional circumstances and traditions that led them to their walks of life. And it was kind of a TV show that was very much in the tradition of Anthony Bourdain or Louis Theroux, okay, where you hang out with them and they say ridiculous things, and you get them to say even more things that are more and more ridiculous, and you try and keep a straight face, or you kind of smirk, or but the point of the whole thing is to draw out who they are, what they believe, and not sometimes to challenge it in subtle ways, but in ways that they might not
fathom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They might not catch.
Yeah.
But you're asking questions, isn't this kind of a little bit crazy? And they just go on and they say something more absurd. So,
do you remember something highly stupid that was said at that time?
No, I remember some things that were really tragic. I remember one of the first women I interviewed, she was in Haryana and Haryana, UP, somewhere there. And there's a shortage of women because there's a lot of abortion of female fetuses. And so a lot of the men don't have brides. And so she was married off to somebody, but she was living in a joint family, and she was shared by 4 brothers who couldn't get married. And so stuff like that. And I remember, I guess one of the maybe funnier incidents would have been, there was an older divorcee, so I went with him to a matchmaker, and he was like, you're divorced, so you have to go for he categorized all the classes of women who are less desirable, so he presented them, and you have to go for one of these categories of women because you're less desirable. And so I hung out with him, and he was showing off his cooking skills. He's like, look at me, I'm such a great groom or a husband, I can cook, I can do this, I can, he was like presenting himself as attractive as if it was a matrimonial kind of promotional ad. Yeah. So it was hanging out with him. And then we went to, we hung out with some other men who, they took me to the pan shop where they get palang tod pan, where they, bed breaking pan, where they, stimulants, full of stimulants. And then they go to some hotel and then, call on prostitutes, that kind of thing. So what are their lives like?
So even the ugly face of Indian patriarchy, basically, right?
Yeah, spaces that I can enter as a man.
Any other face.
I guess, yes.
So anyway, 3 books, as was mentioned, he's written. First is Stringer, A Reporter's Journey in the Congo. Then Bad News, Last Journalist in a Dictatorship. And third is most recent, Breakup, A Marriage in Wartime. I'm going to focus a little bit on Bad News because that resonated the most with me. But before that, let's go with Breakup, A Marriage, because we are on this whole thing of patriarchy, marriage in wartime. How has that impacted? Because a lot of journalists, unless they are, who are married in the field and make their own choices in marriage, find it very difficult to cope because they're out, even if they're not in a war area, they're out all the time, they don't have anything which is regular in their lives, they cover conflict if they're good journalists, they're traveling. So it places strains on marriage. So tell us about yours.
So,
I mean, you've written it, so I'm not being personal, guys, it's all there in the book.
So I guess, the point of the book was to show, it served many purposes, but the point of the book was to show in the initial pages how the marriage allowed me to do my journalism, how it allowed me, it created a sort of anchor that let me go out to
Congo,
places like Central African Republic, in that case, where there was the ethnic cleansing of Muslims was happening, and I reported on that. I traveled through the country with a friend and colleague who's a researcher at Human Rights Watch, and we traveled into villages where massacres were about to happen, were happening, or had happened, and we reported on those things. And unless war reporting is it's very frightening. So constantly you're evaluating and assessing how far can you go, how close to the actual massacre or the killings. And so at every point, you do need a place to go back to, and that place, the ultimate place is home, right? And the marriage. And that sort of provides the sort of anchor for you as a reporter. Like you said, a bunch of us reporters, humanitarian workers, we end up losing the marriage because it places a huge strain to constantly look back on that or lean on that. And for various reasons, marriages break down, but it's not very well reported on or written about. Because this kind of reporting, this kind of vocation has been described for a long time in very macho terms, very masculine terms, to go back to patriarchy. Sort of, I'm the brave reporter, I face war, I'm invulnerable, and those are terms in which most memoirs and accounts of war had been written. So I wanted to make a contribution in the opposite direction to describe the vulnerabilities, the costs, especially from men. Which hasn't been documented. So that was kind of my contribution to open it up. And only now are we talking about journalists, sort of the mental health of journalists, the psychological impacts, the PTSD, family impacts. All of this stuff is relatively new. When I went to Congo at the age of 22, I studied mathematics, showed up in Congo on a one-way ticket, and I found this job with the Associated Press. My editor didn't say anything about, he never asked me how are you doing, or how are the people you're interviewing doing, are you triggering them, or, what's your life like? Nothing. It was very cold, and that was the environment in which he'd been trained and sort of the environment in which I sort of fell into journalism. So all of this stuff is new.
Yeah, it becomes even tougher, I think, if you're a woman journalist in India, because at least when we joined, I think in one of the papers I was the first and the only, and they had to convert a toilet for me because they didn't have any women there, And the same thing, you've got to prove yourself, one, so that's the additional, you've got to be better than the rest because any mistake that you make would come at you. And the second thing is when you're traveling and you're covering conflict, and during the 80s is when we grew up in journalism, is you had Assam and Punjab, and you were seeing violence of the worst kind, and then you're bringing it back home, which is the anchor, which is your emotional secure ground. And then it doesn't really quite play out like that because everybody's not on the same page, right?
Right, and I guess, I can add to that, my ex-wife, the marriage that broke down and breakup, she was also a war reporter. And one of our first trips we made together in Congo, just after we'd met, we went to meet this warlord who had been indicted by the International Criminal Court, and we went to meet him. His name is Matthew Ingujolo. And I did my usual interview, and I asked him, did you commit these crimes? How many people did you massacre? Whatever. And he said, no, I didn't massacre anybody. I was only protecting my community, all that sort of stuff. And then he was sitting on a bucket, upturned bucket. And then my ex-wife went up to him and said, you have been a very bad man. And she wagged her finger at him, and he was like, yes, mama. And she was like, you should not kill anybody else. You should not massacre anyone else. And he was like, no, mama. And I remember I was taking my notes, and I looked up and I thought, I could never get away with this guy. So it's interesting, how as a woman, she suddenly became his mother and played that maternal role. And she was able to have that rapport with him, which I could never have. And so she was able to create a space that I couldn't. And so each of us, I think the genders, there's challenges, but she was somehow able to challenge it, to open up spaces, conversations, dialogues that I couldn't get away with. And so that was also interesting for me to observe.
Yeah, in the field, I think it does work for you. You can make it turn to your advantage in the sense.
I guess.
Yeah, because if you have security, at that time you didn't have women's security, right? So you could break the barriers, and if they reached out to you, don't touch me, I'm a woman. And you're there, right next to the person, right? So anyway, but why did you go to Africa? I mean, was that planned? Was it incidental? Were you excited about the war going on in Congo? Because that's where you went first, right?
Yes, I went to Congo first. I guess the question, I think the more interesting question...
from maths to war.
Yes, I went from maths to war. I can talk about that. But I guess, for me, the more interesting question, which has stayed with me for the last 20 years, is why not Congo and why not Africa? Congo specifically is a war where now 6 million people have been killed directly or indirectly due to the conflict. It's the deadliest war of our times since World War II. And yet it doesn't make the front page. And why not? And that's the question, I think, intuitively that drew me to Congo. And it's still true today. 1,000 people are being killed every day in that conflict. And still we don't see it. We see it buried in the middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page. But I guess what happened to me was I was studying mathematics, very beautiful, abstraction, beautiful mathematical forms. I loved it, but I felt it wasn't connected to the world. And one day at lunchtime, I was rushing to class and I opened the New York Times. Middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page, there was a little article saying 4 million people back then had been killed in the Congo War. And that kind of stayed with me. I wondered, why isn't this on the front page? I don't understand. And one thing led to the next. I bought a one-way ticket to Congo. The reason I went to Kinshasa at that point, I had a few places I could have gone to, but I was paying my final bill at university in the US. And the cashier was African. I asked her, where are you from? She said Zaire, which is the old name for Congo. And I said, I might go to Zaire. And she said, you stupid kids, you can't even sign a check. I could steal all your money. You're going to get robbed or raped or killed. You're so stupid, don't go. And I asked her, can you help me? And she said no. But she had a second job at a parking lot in the city. This is in New Haven. I went to Yale. I was studying at Yale. And she had a night job. By day, she worked as a cashier. By night, she worked as a parking lot attendant. And so I would go every evening, hang out with her, buy her milkshakes, and we hung out. And after a couple of months or something, she said, I asked her again, can you help me? And she said, I'll give you my family's contact. You can stay with them. And so about half of Stringer, my first book, is about my life with that Congolese family, her in-laws, and how, as a journalist, I was trying to figure out how to sell news. And I was writing the news. We say journalists write the first draft of history. And in that family, the stories that were being told, were being handed down to their children, were very different. And so I was trying to make sense of why certain things make the news, why they don't make the news, selfishly because I wanted to survive, earn my living. But also because, I was trying to understand, how is news structured? Why do so many of the stories that Congolese tell each other, whether it's about, rapes or killings or whatever it is, mythologies about their heroes, none of that makes the news in Congo. And you kind of realize, so coming back to your question, why Africa, why Congo, you kind of realize, and that's what I did my PhD in, the structure of international news is such that certain lives are more valuable than others, certain stories are told more than others. So you see Ukraine and Gaza on the front pages of newspapers now as wars, and Congo, which is still raging. I mean, it's flared up now. Rwanda has just invaded Congo. The last time this happened, 6 million people died. So it's a big deal. and yet it still doesn't make the front page. So. There are these structures implicit in international news. Those are the questions that drew me to Congo 20 years ago, and I think they're still relevant today. I think we need to, as reporters in the global south, we need to build systems that challenge and change those things, but that'll happen over time.
Well, we'll come to whether it'll happen at all.
I'm trying to make it happen.
Yeah. But while you were talking, something came into my mind, so I'm going to ask you quickly. You were living the average Indian parent's dream by doing IIT, doing maths, electrical engineering, and then you became their nightmare. The average Indian's nightmare, where you chuck everything and go into and cover a war as a stringer, which couldn't have fetched you much anyway.
No.
So how did your family react to that?
So my mom's in the audience. She's there. Yeah, totally. I think at that point, it was hard for them to understand because I was throwing away. They thought they'd done it. They'd raised the perfect son, Mathematics, was working at a bank, Goldman Sachs, had this job, set for life, everything is solid. And then suddenly I kind of had this urge to buy a one-way ticket, show up in Congo. I think it's still difficult, Now when I'm traveling in Mexico, I live in Mexico, I'm reporting on conflicts there.
I was going to ask you that, yeah.
But I now have human rights groups monitoring me, so every day I check in. And so I ask them now every day, when they check in with me, they send a WhatsApp message to my mom, ma'am, we made contact with Anjan, he's fine. So that kind of reassures her in some way. But yeah, it's kind of
rough, yeah?
Yeah, it's the least I could do.
So Mexico, you're sort of overseeing the construction of the Great Wall?
Well, the president has actually done a great job in Mexico. She's pushed back on Trump. He was going to install these tariffs, and she did a great job, Claudia Sheinbaum. She kind of, she said, I'm sending 10,000 troops to the border, and you should stop exporting guns to Mexico.
Great statement she made.
Yeah, she's sort of pushed back, and she said, well, you're accusing us of sending drugs, but you're sending guns, which are killing, over the last 6 years, 200,000 people have been killed, 30,000 a year in Mexico. We need that to stop. And so she kind of leveled the playing field somehow and got him to push back tariffs, the imposition of tariffs by a month. Whereas Trudeau lost his lost his position. He's gone. She managed to push back and
So exciting times to be there, actually.
I think so.
In every which way, yeah. So I want to get now to my favorite book, which is out of your 3 books, which is Bad News. And I know Vivek likes Stringer more, and I'm sure everybody has their own favorites. I just want to say he writes beautifully. So it has to be read. There's a certain, there's a turn of the phrase. And you do something which I think is interesting. You take news and you present it in a very, what I would call a fictionalized style, which it is not fiction. It is reportage. But you bring in the quotes, you bring in the characters, you write a book in a very different way than any journalist normally would, which is what is very interesting. Is that deliberate, or is that how it comes to you?
So I guess the 2 writers who really inspired me in this kind of form were Ryszard Kapuscinski, the Polish writer who wrote first-person reportage, memoir in a way, and V.S. Naipaul, who also traveled and wrote about himself. But I feel like you want to say?
I just wanted to say you're more readable than Naipaul for the average reader.
Thank you.
Sorry, but
I also feel like I'm more personal than them. I kind of speak about my marriage. I speak about my emotions on a day-to-day level. Like Kapuscinski was apparently a spy. He doesn't reveal any of that. And but they were, as Global South reporters from Poland and Trinidad, reporting on the Global South, writing about the world. They were kind of the people that inspired me. But also I had other reasons for writing about myself. I feel like I'm writing about, so if we take the world as it is, the Congo, despite all these millions of deaths, doesn't get any attention. My idea was, if I write about Congo, the book's going to be obsolete in when the next Congo book comes out. Nobody's going to really care because nobody cares anyway. So can I use my own story as a bridge? So I wrote about how I left mathematics, why I went to Congo, I was living in this Congolese family's house, I didn't make any money. the mother of the house one day, I couldn't pay my rent, so she came to me and she sat down, she was like, what did you study? And I said, mathematics. She was like, you idiot, of course you're not going to sell any journalism, you don't know how to write anything. Well, this is a bad deal my sister-in-law sent you to me, you're never going to be able to pay your rent. So all this kind of personal experiences day to day, I integrate them as a way of making my experience of reporting in Congo more relatable, so people might get interested in learn about Congo sitting on my shoulder through my own story.
Yeah, it's your own story, which a lot of people do anyway, and especially the writers also that you mentioned. But it's also like I did the classic journalist hack thing. I read the first chapter of each book,
Okay.
and then focused on bad news and actually read it. But the first chapter of each book was very, I would have called it sensational had it not been so factual. You know what I mean? It was interesting, you projected it in a particular way, you took incidents out and you pushed that. So I'm talking also of the fact that you're writing a story, you're writing a book without necessarily the journalistic structure.
Completely, and I think that, so there's another angle to that. A lot of journalistic books that I'd read, even Kapuscinski or even Naipaul, they start off kind of from a position of authority. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to start off from a position of ignorance in all my books. I want to take the reader with me and say, hey, there was always, in all these three countries, Congo, Rwanda, Central African Republic, there was a point at which I knew nothing, or almost nothing, but I got interested. So I usually start over there. And I present that to the reader and say, hey, look at what's happening, something sensational, this huge war in Congo, or something like that, or this ethnic cleansing, genocide in Central African Republic. I'm interested for these reasons. If you're interested, let's start at that point where I don't know anything, but we can learn together. And I guess the other reason for writing in this way, which I discovered much later, was that it's therapeutic. So a lot of these reporting on these places is very emotionally draining. It's people end up with PTSD and all that sort of stuff. And I've realized that writing about myself, seeing myself as this character, oh, this is guy Anjan who went and did this happened to him, this person threatened him, this person, he ran in the night trying to get his phone back. All these kinds of experiences, to see myself as a character and to just feel the emotions with some distance, helps me process them and helps me continue this kind of work.
It's like a catharsis also, right?
Yes, exactly. So a lot of journalists stop doing this kind of work because it's so heavy. But I've been able to continue.
But if you write it, you feel much, you can carry it on. Bad News is about Rwanda. It's about, I think you were there a few
5 years.
You were there for 5 years, but what was the period you were there?
2009 to 2014.
Yeah, so this is considerably after the genocide, where 800,000 people, as you said, were killed between April and July in 1994, right?
Yes.
And you went so many years later, and yet that whole stay of yours, you were reliving that genocide. The people there were, in a sense, reliving it. You painted these journalists, you've spoken about these journalists who were all characters and who all sort of made your story really far more exciting in that sense. You've written about everybody, and there's fear, there is intimidation, there's journalists getting killed, shot dead, there's journalists being imprisoned and taken away. I mean, that whole oppressive feeling comes out through your book. Did you feel that a lot?
Yeah, it's like for me, when I was writing it, it felt to me like 1984, George Orwell's, but non-fiction, lived as I experienced it. Because I was feeling the imposition of repression of a dictatorship and the destruction of the free press. So the story was that I showed up in Rwanda, I was writing my Congo book, and I taught a class of about 12 Rwandan journalists. And for me, it was a job. I would earn some money and I could write my Congo book. But as I was teaching them, it was a very special class, and as I was teaching them, one of my colleagues was shot dead on the day he criticized the Rwandan president. Other journalists were imprisoned and tortured in prison, other students that I was teaching, colleagues. Others fled the country fearing for their lives because they had been threatened. And so the book, Bad News, is telling their stories and my story with them, and how I followed them. An incredibly brave journalist. I, as a foreigner, I could leave Rwanda, and I knew that they would at most cancel my visa and I would have to leave. But these journalists, being Rwandan, their families were there, their land, their property, their bank accounts, their children, their jobs. All of this was at risk, and yet they still continued journalism. And I was 26 at the time. And for me, I basically learned what it means to be a journalist. What that journalism means to hold power accountable. And that's what these journalists were doing, these Rwandan journalists. And by following them, this privileged position that I had, they allowed me to follow them, front row seat, like travel with them. I understood and learned far more than from my Pulitzer Prize winning colleagues or any of those mentors. I learned from these reporters, Rwandan reporters, what journalism looks like and what it feels like on the ground, the fear, the repression, the
courage.
Yes, I hid one of these journalists in my home because he'd been threatened. My home was next to the presidential office, so I was living in this house with one of the doors was bulletproof, so I put him in that room and I closed the bulletproof door. And we were hoping that the police wouldn't come and track him there, and helped him kind of get a bus, get out of the country, helped him get asylum eventually. But he went mad. And that was kind of one of the stories. I thought it was the most compelling of all the journalists. Like there were journalists who'd been killed, who'd been imprisoned, tortured, all of that you hear about everywhere. But this journalist, he was one of the brightest, most intelligent journalists that I'd met. He was a philosopher. He was writing about Hegel, and in his reports, he was a really bright thinker. And they didn't need to kill him. They didn't need to imprison him, torture him. They just threatened him so much and made him feel so much paranoia that he lost his mind. And that for me was the power of the dictatorship, that you don't need to necessarily violate someone or be violent. The violence can be psychological and get into your mind, and he destroyed himself. And he's the main character, Gibson, in the story.
He's quite something. And then it also shows the kind of pressure that you went under, because there's a little chapter or a portion in your writing where you talk about how you feel there are people around, and that somebody is looking at you through the door, and that you're locking up the bullet, whatever those doors are.
Yes, actually, so there's a sense, I needed to bring it home again. I bring it home.
And you did.
Yes, I kind of absorb all this pressure, this fear. It does sort of have an impact on me. So there's a scene towards the end of the book where, I think, somebody, not to give away the story, but there's a spy, or a journalist who is a spy, but this Rwandan journalist befriends me. And the moment I realize he's a spy, I think he's coming to get me, and I have a horrible night. And then I realize it was just birds on my roof. And so, it's a very symbolic scene. And
it's something one can identify with, because when you're covering violence and you're in the thick of violence, like anti-Sikh violence in Delhi or in Assam, it's the first time I remember before Nelly, there were many Nellies, everybody knows about Nelly, but there was violence. And for the first time I heard the sound of fear, because they'd picked up all these people and taken them in at the police station. And it's a strange, non-sound sound, which stays with you, it's sort of, that sound remains with you all the time.
Or like this moment in Rwanda when I was at the presidential rally, elections were happening, and the president was doing this rally. And I was taking notes. I was standing in the crowd taking notes, and this police officer came up to me quietly, tapped my shoulder, and said, "Over here, we're not allowed to take notes. I see you looking and writing, and you're not allowed to do that." And I asked him why, and he just said, it looks suspicious. And so I had to put my notebook away, and I began to write on my hand. And I left that rally with my hand full of scribbles, and I had to go to a cafe and then transcribe it from my hand back onto paper. But moments like that stay with you. Quiet. I had to write on my hand and see if he was looking at me or who's looking at me. And so you feel the oppression is kind of...
Because I think they pointed out that it's not necessarily him. He said there are others also who are not in uniform looking at you.
Exactly, right? And so I held my hand in the fist to hide the writing. And so these are the ways that you kind of try to subvert the dictatorship. And I guess, it's like George Orwell, the opening scene of 1984 is Winston is writing, there's a camera in his room, but he's trying to evade the camera and take notes and write something down. And that's his moment, an act in which he finds freedom. And so there are a lot of parallels.
So having lived there, seen this environment and seen what is happening to journalists in this oppressive environment, I'm going to bring it to fast forward it. And there are pockets all over this world. We don't have to go into specifics, but the fact that the journalists are feeling intimidated. You have a new president, say, coming in, and he feels free to threaten any journalist who asks an awkward question.
But in the US? Or?
In the US. And intimidation generally. And you hear of journalists getting shot, arrested. It's becoming more and more common. Fear of violence, people feeling that fear, the masses feeling that fear. So as a journalist, I mean, like you've written in your book, which I thought was very, very poignant, is when you went with these journalists outside and you went and you came across these hundreds of people living in homes without a roof. And when you asked them, they said, we've destroyed our own roofs.
Yeah, that's very powerful. So that again,
very powerful.
Again,
and you can see that happening, like
around the world. Yeah, you can see. I mean, again, that was what caught my attention. It wasn't the murdering of people, torture of people by the government, the use of violent force. That happens, and that's been written about. But I thought the real power of the dictatorship in Rwanda was when I traveled with this journalist who befriended me, who ended up being a spy. One of the ways he befriended me and tried to earn my trust was to take me to these villages where we suddenly were walking through the villages and there were just mud walls and the roofs were gone. And it was a rainy season. People were outside their homes. They were sick with pneumonia. They were drenched, wet. They had no shelter. And I asked them, who did this to you? Who destroyed your roofs? Was it the army? Was it the police? And their answer to me was, no, we did it. We destroyed our own roofs. And
the old man. Tell
yes.
them about the old man who did it for that lady.
Yes, so there was an old lady who had said, the president of Rwanda had apparently at some speech said, I think thatch roofs, huts with thatch roofs are primitive. They look ugly. We need to get rid of them. And so the local authority had heard the president and had taken his words to heart and sort of gone into this village and said, everybody, we need the roofs gone. And there was this old woman who was too old to destroy her own roof. So she asked her neighbor to destroy it for her. And this guy very proudly said, I destroyed her roof for her because she couldn't do it herself. We've complied with the president's orders. And so obeying the president's words was more important than their own shelter. They were willing to self-sabotage, do themselves harm in order to obey the president and be seen as a good citizen. And that for me was the true power of the dictatorship. When it gets into your mind and makes you work against yourself, against those you love, against your community, because being in the good graces of the dictator of the government is so important, and you're so afraid of that you harm yourself and then proudly talk about how you've harmed yourself.
And this is what happens to the media as well. It sort of gets into your mind, and it's happening all over. And you can see it in democracies, you can see it in dictatorships, more and more. They're so scared, so terrified that you implement what you think the master is going to say before he says it. And in the process, don't you feel, now that you've traveled all over, that the media is getting more and more polarized, more and more sort of subjugated to the big thing?
Yeah, I guess it's getting more polarized. It's either angry or sycophantic or propagandist. It's sort of there's a lot of distrust of the media. A lot of journalists feel like they're not respected by the general population, and I think a lot of people feel sort of. They're getting more reliable, they're more prone to living in their bubbles. They feel like they're getting more reliable information off of social media. We're living in very difficult times for what journalism even means, how it's valued. I think, I'm living now in Mexico, which is the deadliest country in the world for journalists, besides Gaza, over the last year. But regularly, Mexico is the deadliest country. Every time these local journalists in Mexico, Mexican journalists report on issues that threaten power, they're taken out. They're just shot dead, and now there's not even protests or on the street. There's not even any mourning. It's just another journalist has been killed. We're living in a very frightening time for information, for who believes what. And I think there are ways that journalists can rebuild trust, and I'm kind of trying to explore some of those avenues. But I feel like the audience that we have is now more niche. People who truly value evidence-based reporting, evidence-based writing. A lot of people want confirmation bias. They want their beliefs to be confirmed, whatever it is. And they kind of follow those people. So I guess we live in an era where influencers and not journalists are kind of at the forefront of society. And they're the ones who get, a million followers on Instagram or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're visible on Twitter, you're more famous than somebody who's doing real solid work. So it's, it's just sort of turned around. And also fake news, propaganda, lies. This is something we spin on a daily basis. And there are television stations all over the world that do that. There's print media all over the world that does it, apart from whatever you see on the social media.
Yeah, to the point where I think, it's like huge, like what's happening in Gaza, for example, the reporting has been incredibly polarized.
Yeah.
And for me, for example, the World Food Kitchen, for example, their workers were killed.
Yeah.
And they were talking about the fact that they couldn't get food aid into Gaza. But the media is so unreliable or so polarized that reputable institutions were claiming that you could get food aid, but they were saying they couldn't. So what's the truth? It gets very blurred. You don't know. It's very hard to follow what's actually happening.
Yes, it must be, younger journalists, particularly in journalism, students always ask you, how do you know what the truth is? How do you find out the truth, right?
Yeah, and actually, so I'm trying to now lean into that. I think we live in a time of visual culture. We also live in a time where subjective narratives hold more weight than objective truths. So I'm trying to lean into that, explore that, rather than fight a battle for objectivity. I'm trying to now, for example, make visual art from my journalism, which I'll be speaking about tomorrow at 11 a.m. I have a session about that. So I'm trying to lean into other forms that are more subjective, that maybe are more accessible and more palatable to our audiences nowadays, and see if people will be more amenable or interested in accessing journalism through these other more subjective forms. And my own memoirs are more subjective, and so maybe through stories, people are more interested in getting into what's happening in Congo or Rwanda.
Right.
Whereas if I just present them with an objective story, a journalistic story, maybe they're like, oh, I don't have time for this, or this is too heavy for me, or whatever. I don't know. Yeah.
So you're not regretting not having gone to Goldman Sachs?
Now, sometimes you do regret, because this journalism is so poorly paid.
Yeah. It's poorly paid, it's dangerous, nobody wants to print the truth very easily.
Yeah, but you get a sense of, I guess on the other flip side, you get a sense of, there's a reward in the work that I just wouldn't as a banker. My friends who became bankers or mathematicians at Goldman Sachs or whatever, now they're coming to me and they have everything, but they're like, what have I done with my life? So that you're spared from. But there are other problems.
I think there's a big flip side, like you said. It's a great side to journalism. I mean, even if it's alternative, even if it's a little space, even if it's a book you've written, a TV series you've done, there is that challenge, and there is that space in journalism still.
Yeah, you feel like you're contributing, you're serving society, you're a public servant in an independent way. Those questions I don't have. So I feel like I've given something to society over the last 20 years. I feel that, and
that needs applause. I think it's important. Yeah.
And as a banker, I think those questions. I think I meet a lot of banker friends who are now seeking to switch careers, midlife crisis or whatever you want to call it, and they're looking to find ways to serve society. That's kind of, we all seek that in the end. A lot of people have approached me and sort of, they're 50, 60, whatever, they've lived their lives and now they're asking themselves questions about legacy, and those kinds of questions in journalism you don't have.
Not at all. Yeah. So we can. Anything else?
No, I'm sure.
To add? And I think it'll be interesting to get some questions, because you'll know what the gentleman here, and then.
Okay. So what really interested me was something you said about the writing part, right? Which is that instead of like an eyeball or where you begin from a position of authority or knowledge, I thought. And you said that you prefer that position of ignorance to begin with. Now, that sounded to me like an academic, because I think an academic typically would want to begin from a position of ignorance, because it's completely the wrong thing to do, and this is research methodology 101 to whatever, where you cannot begin from a position of knowledge. You have to begin by asking the questions, and which basically means ignorance. In the end of the book, you basically say, well, you know, now I have proved my position, now I'm in a position of authority,
Sure.
of knowledge. So, have you been aware that, you know, this is pretty much academic writing, even though it is via storytelling or the format, I mean, the starting point?
Very much so. I think in a maybe less conscious way. A lot of the works I read early on, a lot of the methodologies were, I guess, you know, the anthropologists. They were a lot of my friends. I remember learning a lot from anthropologists. I was reading Levi Strauss and sort of whatever the canonical works of all the academic fields, I would say anthropology. But it was very counter to journalism, because in journalism, the first paragraph is the lead. You need to tell the reader why they should read the rest of the piece. This is what you're presenting. In many books, editors kind of will push you to tell the reader why this book matters, why this book is relevant. And those kinds of questions are very present in publishing, in trade publishing, in mass market publishing. But I really wanted, I felt like what was more engaging was the fact that, the curiosities, what is it about this place and this journey, what is the thread that we're going to follow? And I think that was interesting to me. And I'm trying to think of PhD theses that I read. I guess in the introduction, many academics do kind of begin with what drew them to this question and why they did their field work. So maybe, yes, I guess I haven't commented on this in any defined way. I actually haven't. But I guess I've been aware, but I just haven't seen. Maybe if I wrote for an academic journal, I might draw this out more.
But I just want, as a journalist, I mean, on the field, he's far more qualified than we are. But when you become a field reporter, the first thing that you're taught as part of your, general training is that you empty your mind when you go into a situation. So you really go in ignorance, so that all the information you can get, and you come back, and when you write it, you can write it as dispassionately and as independently and honestly as you can. Whereas if you go in with a preconceived idea about anything, then you bring that prejudice in. And that's something I think we were trained to the extent that I find myself doing that even now, like coming here empty.
Well, good journalists are trained in that way, because then you have parachute journalists who read everything, go in with this idea, this is a story, I'm there to report.
They don't read, they're given handouts.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, and then they go in and they get the story that they knew they wanted to get. So they're not open in their minds to the story that emerges, the story that they're living through. So, and that's a huge problem in foreign correspondence now.
Yes, hugely.
Will AI affect this reporting?
Yeah, of course. I think journalists are going to. I think what's valuable about journalists and what's going to be valued are finding the stories, finding the sources. I think synthesizing the story is going to be done by AI, and I think pulling together, synthesizing all the information that's out there, all the narratives that are out there, it's going to become commodified, and I think. This is what I'm trying to do with some colleagues, is build a news platform that maybe places greater emphasis on the journalists who have that nose for journalism and will go and seek out and find that story where it is and reward that rather than reward the writing of the story, the codifying of the interviews. I think all of that's going to be commodified and it's going to become less valuable. Journalism, I don't know. I do think bringing journalism to other forms which are more subjective, the more we're able to do that, the more valuable and valued and relevant we're going to be. The more objective and factual we are, I think that's a losing game. Information is, is almost worthless now.
Yeah. And then after this.
So how inspiring do you find India today to be, to report from here alongside or instead of Mexico or Africa?
So I guess over the last 20 years, I've been a journalist exactly 20 years now. From Congo, Central African Republic, Rwanda, I went to Cambodia for 5 years. Now I've been in Mexico for 4 years. So I've kind of gone across the global south. I think I've avoided India because it's a bit too close to home. I somehow feel more at ease as an outsider. And I feel somehow I can trust what people tell me in India, or for example in Sri Lanka there was a conflict there and I wondered if I should go to Sri Lanka. But I felt as a Tamilian, I would get a certain side of the story. I would be seen in a certain way. And I felt unsure about the kind of neutrality or the objectivity with which people were going to speak to me, what kind of information they were going to give me. So I chose not to do that. I chose to go into places where I feel I'm an outsider and I can play that card. I'm more comfortable in those situations. But yes, India is getting more interesting for the nature of the government, the closing up of open speech. When I did the TV series, this was in 2016, I remember going to Connaught Circle and I asked them, I just did Vox Pop, which is regular interviewing people on the street. And I asked them, well, what do you think about the government? And they were like, oh, no, we're not going to talk about the government. And I was like, really? I didn't know. The India I grew up in was very different. And I thought that was a subtle change. And so then I remember I was like, nobody's talking to me. So I asked them, say something good about the government. And that they were very happy to do. And then I said, after asking that question, I said, well, what are some of the criticisms of the government? And then they opened up. So I had to be a bit more coaxing, a bit more, I had to make sure that they didn't feel that I was portraying them as critical of the government. So those kinds of things are, you have to just listen to how people speak. And I think, at least for my journalist colleagues, they tell me there's a lot of work to do in India. So
Reporting has become very tough. The gentleman there.
I guess that's more a question for Seema. I mean, she's reporting every day in that.
So she's already reporting from here. What are you doing in Mexico?
Well, Anand, my question is with regards to wartime reporting and peacetime reporting. Like say when I read John Pilger or books like that, when I am taken back into a situation or I am taken back into a time where I do not live. But now, when we are talking about, say, peacetime, say in India itself, most of my friends, journalists, have quit their jobs because they are not happy being journalists in this country. So, one is that yes, there is a need for honest journalists, honest writing, but at the same time, they are not paid or they do not get published. So is it a problem of the journalists? Because I cannot put my TV on, I cannot watch what they speak, or I cannot hear what they speak. So one is that, is it the public which is pushing journalism into this extremely terrible state, or are the good journalists quitting journalism and getting into something else? Like you said that you, with your friends, are thinking about doing something. Some of my friends, similar, they have left India or they have quit their jobs and are thinking about doing something where true journalism exists. But it's still a pipe dream, So my question to you is this, that is journalism dead in India especially?
So I guess, the first trend to remember or note is that the digital news or the digitization of news has meant that journalists and journalistic articles are now competing with entertainment and cat videos. Journalism is competing with cat videos, for example, for clicks. And journalism was never intended to do that, can't compete with cat videos. And that's what we're seeing. Our journalistic articles are not being clicked on and we're not getting paid. And so that's a kind of the techifying of journalism. That's sort of how tech has been brought into journalism. It's completely killed the economic model for how journalists can survive. So that's something that is independent of whether a government is right wing or left wing. That's a global trend. The trends you're pointing to, for me, it becomes the reason I didn't work in India for a long time, to answer ma'am's question here also, was I always felt there are such great journalists working in India. What am I going to add as a young reporter or whatever, 22 years old, 24 years old when I started journalism? What am I going to add, beyond what they're already doing? And I'd rather go to some place like Congo. When I showed up in Congo, I was the 4th international foreign correspondent there. In a country, Congo, the size of Western Europe, 4 million people had died at that point. Only 4 foreign journalists. How? That for me was a bigger question, and I felt like rather than make some marginal contribution in India, I could make a serious contribution to reporting on this global conflict in Congo. So that's kind of the calculus that I made. But as free speech closes up, as the media gets more propagandist, yes, you have a closing up of journalists find it harder, but journalism becomes more meaningful. So that challenge interests me, and that's what I was pointing to. Now I'm more interested. I feel like there aren't that many journalists. I gave a talk at Harvard 2 years ago, and my interlocutor, my interviewer, he was a BBC journalist, foreign service in India, Indian journalist. And he said, we need journalists now in India. And nobody's ever said that to me. There were always so many great journalists in India. And now they're saying we need journalists. But I guess I would ask Seema as well. I mean, you're doing the work here. So do you feel journalism is dead? What's your answer?
Well, it's dying pretty fast. It's, there's, like he said, so many have left, etc. There's a lot of pressure on journalists. I'm basically a print media journalist, and I really love to write, and I had to opt for digital because I thought there's some space there, and there's some rules and regulations because of which you could manage with digital. But I was telling you, we had a case slapped on us of 7,200 crores. We had 1 lakh in the bank, but 7,200 crores from Ambani right at the beginning when we came out on some story. Anil Ambani had a problem, which means you have to get the lawyers, you have to go, you have to get, so there's the harassment. We have currently cases against us on Manipur. So, there's constant intimidation all over the world. I think it's increasing. People don't like the messenger anymore. Big corporations have started owning the papers. You can see Musk in the White House, money has started controlling it. And like what you said, an alternative economic model was so important. We had some of it in India, like the wage board, and we had cooperatives. That's all gone out of the window. Everything is controlled by the corporation. Big business goes with the politician and with the power in place, whatever the power is. All governments and big corporations now have this nexus. So where does the journalist come? They don't want the truth. They don't want you reporting the truth.
Right, and I guess I would add to that, last year I gave a talk at TED. I gave a talk on their main stage. So these are the kinds of forums that I now seek out, not necessarily journalistic forums, but storytelling forums. So I gave a talk about my Mexico reporting, about this environmental war reporting. And a couple of philanthropists approached me and asked me, how can we recognize that the kind of journalism you're doing is dying out across the world? And how can you help us create a foundation to support journalists, freelance journalists, independent journalists around the world? And so I'm now trying to build a system, create a structure, because it's a huge need. Your point, what your friends are telling you, they're not alone. It's happening around the world, and we need new structures, new foundations, new economic models, philanthropic, corporate, for-profit, to sustain us, because as Seema saying, I mean, you need lawyers, you're being attacked by corporations with armies of lawyers, you're being attacked by organized crime with weapons and gundas or whatever. You're being attacked by governments, dictators, with the whole security force, police, armies, whatever, against you. The threats are from all fronts, and journalists are independent, alone. And if the law is not going to protect us, then how do we build a community that protects, where we help each other, protect each other? That's where we are.
Can society function without good journalism?
No, a democratic society. No, if wherever there's power is going to be abused, and you need journalists to hold that power accountable, to stop that abuse of power, and to bear witness. And that's never going to go away. In fact, the more power there is in these centers of power, organized crime, or governments, or corporations, the more abuse of power there's going to be, the more relevant and necessary journalists become. But the less these powers want journalists. They don't want to be held accountable. So it's a constant battle.
What do we do that?
People can do, can I answer this? People can do a thing, you can subscribe, you can pay. Everybody wants, like in India, everybody wants free news. You don't want to pay for your news. If you don't want to pay for your news, then all the people who are there digitally or trying to give you an alternative voice, lots on YouTube, etc., they don't get the money. They're not able to survive. Lot fold up because nobody wants to pay. Everybody who's crying the loudest about press freedom are the people who are not supporting a free press, even if it's a niche. So that is it has to go back to the masses, and people have to feel and understand their responsibility in keeping the fourth pillar of democracy free. I'm sorry, there's some questions, but you want to say that?
I'll be around afterwards, so I'm happy to speak to anybody individually.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Seema.
Really
Thanks
good.
for the questions.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to the festival, the Goa Literary Festival, Gareth, for bringing us. And
thank you so much for keeping to time as well. This conversation definitely needs to continue. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll keep this here.
Come back in 5 minutes, please. The next session will start.
Great.
Thanks, Seema. Yeah.
We have to keep in touch.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Are you?
I'm till Sunday.
Oh, so when we keep in touch.
I have your WhatsApp now.
You have that. I have yours.
Need a picture of it. Oh, we have a photograph? Ma'am, we very delighted to.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question also.
Huh? It was good. All you are shooting raw, Image quality raw. Okay. Good. No, these photos are coming very soft. I saw the photos.
Soft.
Yeah.
Maybe I have not done white balance properly.